All right, so in this section, we are going to go ahead and take advantage of some of the things that we've learned so far.
And we're going to start by creating a very simple game asset using a bunch of the tools and features that we've learned. Now, we'll also cover a few new tools and tricks, as well as a couple new additional UI features that we haven't quite talked about yet, just to kind of make things a little bit easier for me as I model this asset out. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with blocking out the asset. And as I work through this piece, what we would traditionally do is very similar to how we talked earlier when we did our weight bench prop back in lesson 1. Now, as I pull this out, I'm seeing that I have a few things going on. Number one, the color is set to black. I was doing another file. So let's go ahead and just change this color back to sort of this bluish color. And we just did that by simply highlighting on this. We have our bounding box on. Let's go ahead and turn that guy off. Now, what this asset is going to be is a very simple mailbox asset. Now, just like what we had in our weight bench, I would traditionally want to have some sort of a reference image. But for this guy, I'm just going to model him from, sort of my own mind and some real basic simple shapes to kind of get us started with, exploring some of the new tools and features that we're going to look at. Now, all I'm doing here is I'm going to go ahead and start off with sort of a very similar principle like what we talked about before, with just kind of throwing down some basic quick shapes to kind of block in the piece that we're looking at for this mailbox. And so I'm not really going to worry too much about absolute precision right now. I'm just kind of throwing down some basic pieces. And so, for example, what I'm doing here is this is going to kind of represent the concrete base of our mailbox, and this will be, a simple piece of wood. And I'm just going to quickly convert these to editable poly. And now if I grab both of these assets, one thing that I can do, and I just want to recap what we probably did a little bit earlier, is we'll simply grab these two pieces and we'll right click on that move tool, and then we'll simply right click on the spinners to set everything to the native position of 0, 0, 0. Now, since we have multiple pieces selected, you'll notice that there's no value here unless we drag that spinner around, in which case it kind of resets back to nothing here. But we do know that when you have multiple pieces selected, if I go ahead and right click on these spinners, that'll default it to 0, which basically just means that it's going to move both of these pieces here to the 0, 0 position on this grid. And you can see the grid here left to right. A lot of times we will hide it if we're just kind of free modeling, but for now we'll go ahead and leave that up. Now, what I want to do is turn off this realistic view and just sort of throw down some real simple sort of representative ideas of kind of what I want to do. I'm imagining this mailbox to kind of have a little bit of a concrete post here that, maybe sticks into the ground or the dirt or along the side of the road. And this will be kind of this wooden beam that, is supporting the mailbox. We'll scale them down just a little bit. And now one trick that I like to use a lot of is when I'm creating different pieces or different shapes that are very similar to each other, rather than going back over here and clicking and creating a new cylinder, I'm going to use this cylinder that we already have by simply having him highlighted, holding down the shift key, and dragging up another copy of it. I know we talked a little bit about this before, but the whole principal idea here is that we are able to just kind of duplicate and mirror around geometry that we already have without having to go through the process of creating a brand new piece. Now, one thing that you'll notice is I want to turn this guy exactly 90 degrees. And before, we had played around with the type in values down along in here, and we could also right click on the move tool and set a value there. But a new feature I want to show you is the snaps tools along the top here. These are the 4 different snap toggles that you can turn on. And the primary one that I'm going to be concerned with right now is the angle snap toggle. And so if I left click this guy, that will actually turn the tool on, and then we can kind of rotate it based on the default value that it is set to. Now, to set that value, what you want to do is you want to right click on the tool, and this will bring up your grid and snap settings. And so what this is going to do is this is telling you, okay, when you rotate or you use this, it is going to snap at an angle of 5 degrees and a radius of 20 pixels, preview radius of 30 pixels, or 10%. Now, it's a lot of information, but the primary one that we're going to focus on here is the angle. And what this means is that when it's set to 5, as I rotate it, you'll notice the yellow box that kind of pops up along the top here, or rather the yellow text, is telling me the exact percentage that I'm rotating it along which axes. Right now you'll see that it's 0, 30, and 0. And that means that I'm rotating it along the y-axis, and it's snapping since I have my grids and snaps turned on. And as it is snapping, it's snapping in 5-degree intervals. And so this is really handy for once we've turned our snaps on, is if I want to rotate this exactly 90 degrees, I don't have to worry about typing it in or doing a manual operation at all. We can just leave that on. And so now every time when we use the rotate tool, it's going to snap precisely to a fixed percentage point. And so now that we have this cylinder, it's obviously offset just a little bit. And so what we want to do is we'll go ahead and reset our pivot to 0, or rather reset it to the center of the object by clicking on the Hierarchy tab, Effect Pivot Only, and Center to Object. And so now we've centered this pivot point of this cylinder right to the middle of it. And so from here we can just right click on the Move tool and bump him back up to the center of the y-axis. Now if we zero out the Z, that'll snap him down here to the bottom, but I'm happy with where he's at right here, kind of along the base of this post. And so what I want to do from here is just kind of scale him out a bit, remembering that the scale tool is going to be based on the pivot point. So that's kind of part of the reason why we wanted to center it out, is not only to make sure that it's rotating correctly, but also so that our scale tool functions accurately. And so while we're not going to use just a flat cylinder for our mailbox, this mailbox top kind of has a nice rounded dome shape to it. And so the cylinder is a good base point to kind of start from. And so what I can do from here is go into a front view. I'm going to switch to vertex mode. I'm going to grab these series of verts here, right along the center. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and use the Kinect tool. And if you remember from our previous lesson, that is going to basically create a bridge of an edge that goes right in between the verts that I have selected. And since I was in a front view, I'm selecting both the front and the back. And so now that we've got this kind of a start to it, I'm going to switch to polygon mode and actually delete out the bottoms of that cylinder along that edge, or rather along those faces. And so from here we can use our border tool, and like our previous lesson, we talked about being able to drag some edges down. And so if I hold down the Shift key, I can kind of drag the surface of that down to kind of give us that, you know, traditional classic mailbox shape. And so I'll kind of find a size and scope that's, you know, somewhat reasonable for right now. And we're always going to kind of be going back and forth, you know, adjusting the size, adjusting the scale of it. But for right now, that's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Now we don't want to have an open hole here, so I'm going to switch back to border mode and grab that border, and I'm going to right click and use the cap tool. And that's going to go ahead and close that bottom part off. So now it's a nice solid mesh. And so that's looking like a pretty good start. So now let's focus on the side posts and cutting a hole through the center of this guy so that we can, you know, where the mail would go, and then we'll focus on a little bit of a flag piece. And so as we're modeling this, we can always take a look at stuff and different pieces and kind of, you know, reanalyze the scale of it, just to kind of get a better idea, you know, of what's going to be a little bit more of an accurate mesh. You're never going to get the actual dimensions and perfect size and scope 100% perfect every single time. And part of the creative process of working in 3D is to, you know, kind of quickly throw down some stuff and then make adjustments as needed to get the shapes that you want. Now this is a good start. One of the things I'm going to do next is I'm going to actually use this board that we made here as sort of a duplicate, as kind of a little post that we're going to use for a base of the bottom of it where a board's going to kind of connect up. And so with this board selected, I want to reset the pivot point on it as well, set it to 0, or rather centered to the object. And now with him selected, I'm going to drag him out, make a copy of it, and scale it down. And since we drug it, you know, straight off from that surface, I know that it's already going to be aligned perfectly centered to the board that we drug it out of. And so for example, if we make another copy, you know it's always going to be perfectly aligned down that y-axis. Now if you hold down the Shift key and you hover your mouse kind of in the middle, this is kind of a little bit of a loose you know, guessing game here as far as where it's going to be. But if you always hold down Shift and pull it along a specific axis, you'll always be able to get the object exactly where you want it to be. And so for this piece, we can switch to the left view, And all I'm going to do is just kind of eyeball this with toggling on and off to my wireframe with the F3. I'll switch to vertex mode. And I'm just going to kind of butt these vertices here along the side, as if maybe you'd, nailed it in there or sort of added a peg or a post or something to kind of get this guy a little bit of a support along the front or the back of the mailbox. Now, as soon as I look at that, I'm like, well, that looks stretched a little bit. Maybe that doesn't look correct. So we'll pull this up slightly. Maybe grab these verts, just kind of make the thickness a little bit more uniform. Kind of take a look at it. And that looks pretty good. As I'm looking at this, I'm kind of thinking, well, maybe that base needs to be a little bit wider. And if you remember, if we hover our mouse over any one of these individual axes along the sides of this triangle, we can kind of make it just thicker without adjusting the rest of the silhouette of the cylinder. And so let's pull the bottom verts down slightly. Kind of find a nice happy level where it looks like it's got a little bit of beef to it on that concrete. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to take this post that I've created and I want to switch it over to the opposite side over here and make sure that it's absolutely even, to this center board that we created. Now, if you remember from lesson 1, we took advantage of that working pivot, and that's going to be exactly how I'm going to do this on this piece here. We'll switch back to the hierarchy tab. We'll click on use working pivot, which will keep us right there at that 0, 0 point on the grid. And so if we know that that's zeroed out, we can just go ahead and use the mirror tool and mirror this along the y-axis. And we're going to set this to instance. We haven't used instances yet, but once you start using editable poly objects as opposed to primitives, this is where getting in the habit of using instances is going to really save you a lot of time. And so if we go ahead and hit OK, essentially what an instance is if you can imagine going into making a copy of something at Kinko's and you walk away from there and anyone who has that original copy makes a change to it, every one of the copies that you have also is changed and updated. And so for example, if we switch over to vertex mode, any changes that I make to this guy will also happen to this guy over here. And so whether we scale it, move it, or whatever it is that we do to these individual sub-objects, you'll see that the exact same thing is happening to the piece on the opposite side. Now when you actually go to object mode, let's say that you decide that you want to move it up and down. Regular movements and scale, for example, if I just scale this guy locally, that's not going to affect it. However, if I grab the individual sub-objects, for example, like let's say I grab just these verts and I scale them on the sub-object level, then that will transfer over. And so object mode, nothing's going to happen, whereas sub-object mode, this will affect both of your instances. And so obviously one of the big advantages to this is that this way we don't have to model both of these individual boards. We can just do one and then instance it over, and any changes we make to one will affect the other one.